Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. After a day filled with tension, conversations, negotiations, and finally, triumph, I was heading home. Today, the exhibition I'd been working on for months had opened successfully. People were looking, discussing, asking questions, while society reporters clicked away, capturing moments. It was my victory. Maybe not the grandest, but it was significant for me. I felt satisfied and energized, thinking about sharing this evening with Alex. When I entered the apartment, everything seemed as it usually did. Alex sat at the table, his eyes focused on his laptop screen. A curt, "Hi," without even looking up, sounded automatic, without a hint of interest or engagement. "Hi," I replied, feeling my excitement slowly drain away. I stood in the doorway, as if on the verge of something important. I waited. But for what? Attention? A look? A few words that might show he cared about my achievements? It seemed that this was nothing but a naive hope. The exhibition opened today, I tried to remind him, though I knew there was no need. Of course, he knew. I'd mentioned this day over and over again. Alex nodded without lifting his gaze from the screen. "That's good," he said, as if for formality's sake. "How did it go?" I sat across from him, hoping to catch his eye, to see even a flicker of genuine interest. But his fingers continued tapping away on the keyboard, giving me no chance to respond. "Not bad," I replied briefly, realizing that further recounting my evening would be pointless. Did he really want to know? "Great," he muttered. "I need to finish this project. The deadline is next week." I stayed silent, swallowing the bitterness. This wasn't the first time, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. Alex, always absorbed in work, hardly saw me as anything more than a companion nearby. Lately, I'd felt like I was just part of his life as a convenient fixture, something stable and constant in a world that didn't matter much to him. He didn't need details, neither my joy nor disappointments, just my presence. I walked over to the window and sat in the armchair. Outside, the evening city lights shone brightly, beckoning and subtly reminding me that life was full, larger than everything here in this room. And me? Why was I stuck here, in this box, feeling the days slip by, without awareness, without a spark? Maybe it was because I'd walked into this routine myself, lost parts of myself, forgetting those pieces that once defined me. For a moment, I froze, caught by this thought. We were the perfect couple, stable, predictable, settled. I used to be proud of that. But somewhere along the way, I'd lost myself. I made a choice, but what was it? A sacrifice? A compromise? At that moment, a phone call interrupted my thoughts. I picked up, unsure for a second who it might be. An unknown number, a sharp voice cutting through my mind. "Jessica, hi, it's Graham. We met at the exhibition. Just wanted to thank you for the evening. It was something special." Graham, the gallery's new investor. I remembered him. He was there among the guests, confident, even a little arrogant, but not annoyingly so, like many of our regular patrons. There was something sharp and inquisitive in his gaze, like someone who sees beyond the surface and searches for something genuine. "Oh, Graham, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it," I replied, and somehow I felt my voice soften, a warm flicker stirring in me. "Enjoyed it? That's an understatement. You did an outstanding job. I could see how much heart you put into the project. That's rare to see." His words hit me. He noticed that? He saw what I'd poured into this exhibition? Why did these words feel so different from Alex's casual "great"? "Thank you," I replied, trying to mask the hint of surprise and relief in my voice. It was an important project. We talked for a few more minutes, discussing art, and without realizing it, I relaxed, lost in the conversation. Graham asked about my views on modern art, the exhibition, future projects. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had shown so much interest in what truly mattered to me. It seems like you live for this, Jessica. His voice held genuine interest. That's something to respect. I didn't know how to respond. These words were simple, but I felt he genuinely meant them. To my own surprise, I smiled. Nice to hear that, I said quietly, feeling something warm and calm within me. When the conversation ended and I hung up, a wave of confusion washed over me. Someone else in this world had seen my efforts, appreciated them, and it wasn't my husband. The next day, I returned to the gallery with a slight sense of anticipation. Graham's call the night before had unexpectedly lifted my spirits, as if it pulled me out of some hidden well of exhaustion. We'd arranged to meet to discuss new projects, and while I'd never expected anything special from such meetings before, something felt different today. Was it his passion for art that drew me, his genuine interest? Or perhaps it was his voice, calm, assured, as though he knew all the answers. When I walked into the gallery, Graham was already waiting by the wall with a new installation. He turned and smiled, raising his eyebrows slightly, as if genuinely pleased to see me, rather than just waiting for a business partner. "Jessica, good to see you," he said with a subtle emphasis, adding a touch of something more than mere formality. "Graham, hi," I replied, trying not to show how that unexpected warmth unsettled me. We walked through the gallery, discussing potential changes in the layout. Graham spoke as if he had a clear vision in his mind, each of his points sounding like a carefully thought-out puzzle piece. I listened, asked questions, and he answered with enthusiasm, as though he was truly captivated by our conversation. "I think art is always a bit about who we are," he remarked at one point, narrowing his eyes slightly. "Our vulnerabilities, our desires, our fears. We can't hide behind paint or sculpture, no matter how hard we try." I stopped, trying to process his words. There was something deeper there, beyond mere philosophy about creativity. "And how would you describe your own desires?" I asked, without thinking how personal it might sound. The question slipped out on its own, but Graham seemed as though he'd been waiting for it. "My desires?" He paused briefly, looking at some invisible point on the wall before turning back to me. "Honesty and courage, that's what I need. Especially when I meet those who, like me, aren't afraid to seek answers, even if it means asking uncomfortable questions." A shiver ran through me at his words. I couldn't tell if it was just a professional conversation or something more. And yet, I couldn't ignore how his words sank into my mind, making me ponder. "Maybe we could continue this conversation over coffee?" he suggested with a slight smile, his gaze carrying a hint of approval, as if he already knew I would agree. "Yes, of course. Why not?" I tried to keep my tone steady, but inside, something stirred, as if I was stepping into the unknown, something I couldn't refuse. We strolled down the street to a small cafe with wooden tables and softly glowing lamps. The cafe was cozy, even a bit intimate, and the air was filled with the aroma of freshly ground coffee and cinnamon. We chose a table by the window, overlooking the bustling street. Yet sitting together, we seemed to be in a world of our own. We talked about everything: life, art, the meaning of words and actions. The conversation grew more open, yet remained light, as though neither of us feared being vulnerable. "I noticed how dedicated you are to your work," Graham said, narrowing his eyes slightly. "That's something rare. I sense it's important for you to be recognized." I felt his words catch in my throat. He was right. That was the truth. But why was it him who said it, and why did it sound so natural? "Maybe," I replied, not wanting to open up too much, yet feeling a strange connection. "Sometimes it feels like I find something more in the work than just the outcome." Graham looked at me intently, without pressing for more, as if he understood that he had said enough. When it was time to say goodbye, we left the cafe and stopped on the sidewalk. The night was quiet, with a cool breeze, and I thought our conversation had ended when I felt his touch. A light, almost accidental brush of his hand, as if there was nothing but air between us, and yet, an electric tension. We stood there on the empty street, surrounded by the soft glow of nightlights, and as he leaned slightly toward me, I realized I wasn't pulling away. His kiss was light, fleeting, almost incidental, but in that moment, I felt something shift inside me. Graham stepped back, and I saw a serious look in his eyes, as if he was waiting for me to say something, but there were no words, only surprise and confusion. "I'm sorry," he said, sounding uncertain, and I detected a hint of hesitation in his voice. "That was unplanned." I nodded, trying to steady my breathing and comprehend what had just happened. My mind was shouting that this was wrong, that it shouldn't have happened, but in my heart, a feeling suddenly arose that I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of lightness, of anticipation for something new, and perhaps something dangerous. The last few days, I couldn't seem to find peace. Since that evening in the cafe, it was as if a new world had opened before me. Everyday life, the routine I shared with Alex, seemed dull in comparison whenever I recalled my conversation with Graham. His words, the gentle touch, and that unexpected, genuine kiss on the street. Every morning, I'd catch myself thinking, what if I see him again today? The anticipation of these fleeting encounters seemed to spur me on, making my days brighter. Graham was the kind of person who simply brought new meaning, new shades to everything. It wasn't just simple attraction or gratitude that he could see the real me. No, with him, everything felt different. But guilt crept into my thoughts, like a cold fog clouding clarity. Each time Alex entered the room or was simply nearby, the feeling became just a bit sharper. He never asked about my day, didn't inquire about new projects. Our conversations had dwindled to a few brief, routine phrases, devoid of any genuine involvement. But in my mind, Graham was vivid, real, brimming with interest and understanding. I realized I was trying to escape burdensome thoughts, diving into memories of that single kiss that, for now, remained my secret. That evening, as Alex and I sat down for dinner, I knew that the conversation ahead, as always, would be tense. I tried to keep calm, but inside, everything was simmering. I felt like I was on the edge. Our rare talks had long since lost meaning, like an old, familiar ritual devoid of life. "Did you have a meeting with a client today?" I finally asked, hoping the conversation wouldn't falter right from the start. "Yes, I did." "Nothing special," Alex replied, his gaze fixed on his phone. "How was your day?" A simple question, but irritation flared within me. Was he really interested? Or was it just politeness? And if it was politeness, why even bother asking? "Good," I replied dryly, lifting my fork to my lips, though I felt no appetite. "Yesterday, I met with a new gallery investor." He nodded, still focused on his screen. "This is a major project for us," I added, hoping to ignite at least a flicker of interest in him. He's someone who truly appreciates art, knows how to connect with people. Alex mumbled something inaudible, not even lifting his eyes. His indifference burned me from within, and I realized that, in that moment, I envied his calmness. He seemed entirely absorbed in his affairs, and apparently I was no longer part of that realm of interest. Our conversation fizzled out, and we continued our dinner in silence, broken only by the sounds of cutlery. With each silent moment, I felt increasingly like a stranger beside the person who had once been close to me. And no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that everything could be fixed, just the thought of the upcoming meeting with Graham brought back a feeling I hadn't felt in ages. Anticipation, like a dream come to life. The next day, I was back at the gallery. We were to discuss the details of the new project, and I had to make an effort to appear focused on work, not on the emotions overwhelming me. When I entered the hall, Graham was already there, observing the latest exhibit with a thoughtful look. He turned to me and smiled, as if he knew what I was feeling. as if we both shared this silent, indescribable connection. "Good to see you again, Graham," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Jessica." He spoke my name as though it were something special. "You know, I've been looking forward to this meeting. I felt like our last conversation was left unfinished." "Perhaps," I admitted, feeling a warm thrill spread within me. "But we're here for work, aren't we?" "Of course," he agreed, though something deeper flickered in his eyes. "But art often inspires thoughts that go beyond the ordinary." We continued discussing the project, but with each word, I realized I was hearing less of the ideas and more of the intonations in his voice, the glances he held just a bit too long. Our fingers almost brushed as we both reached for one of the paintings at the same time. I quickly drew my hand back, but the faint electric charge from that brief touch still hung in the air. As the meeting came to an end, I felt both drained and exhilarated. The sense of guilt still burned within me, but at the same time, I couldn't resist the impact Graham had on my life. He had awakened feelings in me that had long lain dormant, filling voids I hadn't even realized were there. As we said goodbye, he held my hand a moment longer than necessary. That small gesture once again left me with that sweet yet bitter certainty that with each passing moment, I was drifting further away from what had been my reality. When Graham invited me to his exhibition, I wasn't sure how to respond at first. A strange unease washed over me, but I agreed, not fully understanding why I couldn't say no. Maybe it was the confidence he had that I would understand his work. This evening was meant to be another professional meeting, yet I knew our interactions had already surpassed the bounds of mere collaboration. I felt drawn to him, his words and ideas gradually becoming an important part of my life. That evening, as I entered the small art center, I immediately spotted Graham. He was immersed in conversation with one of the guests, but upon noticing me, he walked over with an easy, effortless smile. "Jessica, I'm glad you came," he said, warmly shaking my hand. His touch was gentle and enveloping, and I felt something tighten within me. "I'm glad too. Tell me, how did you find the courage to do this?" I asked, nodding toward the walls lined with his paintings and photographs. He paused briefly before replying, "It's a risk. Art is always a step into the unknown. You know what I mean, don't you?" His words stirred something familiar within me, as if he knew exactly what to say to reach the deepest parts of my soul. I looked at his work, trying to grasp his thoughts, his essence. There were abstract paintings created with unexpected sharpness, bold strokes. The photographs seemed to reveal Graham's inner world, intense, full of contradictions, uncharted. In every detail, I found echoes of the questions that troubled me. "These works, they're so bold," I said, not taking my eyes off one of the photographs, a cityscape with a lone figure in the background. "They convey solitude and the desire to move forward, despite it." "You've understood the essence," Graham said softly, his voice serious. "Sometimes, I think we choose solitude just to feel truly alive." He said this while looking at me with an indescribable expression, as if searching for an answer hidden in my eyes. And I couldn't look away. "You know, Jessica," he continued, not breaking his gaze, "art and risk are inseparable. If you're afraid to take risks, you'll never create anything meaningful. It's the same in life. Sometimes you need to take a step into the unknown, even if it's frightening." His words hung in the silence, and I felt them resonate within me, as though Graham wasn't just talking about himself, but challenging me. Being near him made me feel alive, truly myself, as if he was the only one who could see me in a way I hadn't dared to see myself. We walked around the exhibition, absorbed in discussion. With each new piece, with each of his explanations, I felt our connection deepening, becoming something far greater than mere conversation. His philosophy, his courage, inspired me. When we approached the last photograph, he lingered, running his finger along the frame, as if recalling the moment he captured the shot. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "sometimes I doubt whether it's worth showing people my vulnerability. But maybe, by showing it, I give someone else the courage to take a risk too. I stayed silent, not knowing what to say. He was opening up to me, something so personal I didn't want to break it with words. Instead, I simply stood beside him, feeling as though I was at the center of his world. Later, as the gallery emptied out, we found ourselves alone. Graham invited me to a small cafe nearby. We sat at a table, our conversations flowing from one topic to another, yet always circling back to art and the risk he'd mentioned. Graham explained that for him, art wasn't only a form of expression, but also a way to understand himself. He spoke about his doubts, his fears, the places where he found inspiration. I listened, feeling as though he was sharing more than just stories. He was revealing to me something he'd long kept hidden within. Tell me, Jessica, have you ever wanted to do something without regard for anyone else's opinion? Simply because it felt right? His voice was quiet but resolute. The question caught me off guard, and I paused to think. I may never have dared to ask myself that question. It turned out that I had all the answers long ago, but I was afraid to say them aloud. Yes, I finally said, barely realizing that I was opening up to him. But sometimes I doubt that I have the courage. Graham nodded, showing not a hint of surprise. In his gaze, I saw only understanding, as though he had always known I would say this. Courage comes when you're ready to accept the consequences, he said, smiling slightly. Art and life are the same in that way. These words, these looks, filled with hidden meaning, once again left me alone with myself. I understood that being near him made me feel different, as though this entire situation was more than just a passing infatuation. When Graham invited me to dinner, the proposal took me by surprise. It was just a regular workday, filled with tasks and calls, when, in the middle of the day, I received a message from him. Are you free this evening? I know a great spot with amazing risotto. If you don't mind the company, I'd love to invite you. I stared at the screen for a few moments before responding. My heart was racing, and my mind resisted. The idea of dinner with Graham in an informal setting felt too personal, too significant. But something inside me couldn't refuse, so I sent a short yes. We met on the corner of one of the city's old streets, and as I approached, Graham was already waiting for me by the entrance. It was the first time I saw him in such a relaxed style. He was wearing a soft cashmere sweater instead of the usual business suit. When he saw me, he gave a wide smile, which instantly eased the tension I had felt all day. Thank you for agreeing, he said, holding the door open. I thought a small break might do you good too. The restaurant turned out to be small and cozy, with dim lighting, wooden tables, and vintage lamps that filled the atmosphere with warmth and calm. We sat at a window table overlooking the evening city, the streetlights casting a yellow glow on the sparse couples strolling under the autumn trees. When the menu arrived, I couldn't focus on reading. Graham was studying it with a serious expression. Then he looked at me. If you don't mind, I'll order for both of us. They have fantastic risotto and an unusual vegetable salad here. I smiled, feeling how easy it was to agree with him. Sounds wonderful. Do you come here often? Sometimes when I need to think, he replied, his gaze turning slightly more pensive. This place reminds me of how important it is to find something constant, like there's a point you can come back to, especially in our world, where everything is so unpredictable. I nodded, understanding what he meant. Our lives were indeed made up of events, meetings, and projects that threw us into chaos. I often dreamed of something steady, something that wouldn't vanish if you let your guard down for just a second. When the waiter brought the dishes, Graham raised his glass and, looking into my eyes, said, To people who know how to create and aren't afraid to feel, to those who search for answers in art, no matter how hard it might be, to those who aren't afraid to ask questions, even if they're unsure of the answer, I added, a bit shy under his warm gaze, yet I touched my glass to his. Our conversation flowed effortlessly from one topic to another, from art to childhood memories, from fears to the desire to make a difference in the world. Graham listened intently, asking unexpected questions, and I found myself thinking there was something oddly familiar about him. At one point, I felt that he understood me better than I understood myself. Have you ever thought about what makes us feel alive? He asked, looking thoughtfully across the table. I think it's something elusive, I answered, choosing my words. Maybe it's the ability to see beauty where it seems there is none, or the capacity to accept oneself, contradictions and all. There's a depth in you, Jessica. That's rare, he said, and I felt his words touch something deep within me. There was sincerity in his voice that made me want to believe he saw something special in me. After dinner, Graham suggested a walk around the streets near the restaurant. The evening was cool, and I wrapped my coat tightly around myself, while he offered his arm as if it were the most natural thing. We walked through narrow streets, among lanterns and autumn leaves, talking about things people rarely discuss with new acquaintances. I felt an invisible wall between us dissolve, as if he had always been there. Suddenly, the first drops of rain began to fall, and I looked up. Dark clouds stretched above us, and soon the rain poured down harder. We ran to the nearest store awning, laughing like children caught in a storm. I turned to him, laughing, and suddenly realized we were alone together in this nighttime, rain-drenched city, in a small shelter where the rain was the only sound around us. You know, I've never been this soaked before, I said, trying to shake the drops from my hair, though I knew it was futile. I have an idea to save the evening, he said, looking at me with a slight smile. How about finding the nearest hotel? I don't think this rain will stop anytime soon. I hesitated for a moment, but I already knew the answer. This evening was so special that I couldn't just go home and forget everything. We quickly found a small hotel on the same street. Taking the key from the receptionist, we went up to the room, and there I finally felt my body start to warm and relax. We hung up our jackets, and Graham turned on a lamp, filling the room with a soft light. I sat on the bed, rubbing my cold hands, and at that moment, I felt Graham sit down next to me. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw something more than just friendliness. There was a closeness, a warmth I hadn't felt from someone in a long time. Jessica, he began, but stopped, as if searching for the right words. I met his gaze, and suddenly the space between us disappeared. Graham leaned in. His lips touched mine, and I understood that this moment was more than just an impulse. The streets were noisy and crowded. The evening city was filled with bright lights and people absorbed in their own hustle. I was on my way to an exhibition organized by my gallery, preparing to meet familiar faces, greet guests, and, as usual, immerse myself in the polite and professional conversations the event demanded. I felt a slight unease, not related to the event itself, but rather to my own state, in which thoughts of Graham were taking up far too much space. In recent days, I'd tried to keep my distance from him, avoiding places where I might run into him, but tonight left me with no escape, and I realized that this conversation was inevitable. The exhibition was lively, festive, filled with laughter and conversation. I moved among the guests, offering friendly smiles, discussing art and work. Yet amid these exchanges, I suddenly felt a familiar presence. He was standing by one of the exhibits, slightly turned toward the light, so that half of his face was in shadow. I froze for a moment, feeling a wave of anxious anticipation. Graham hadn't seen me, but his sudden appearance seemed to draw me toward him, as if fate had once again placed us side by side at this moment. I took a step forward, approached him, and as he felt my gaze, he turned. His eyes flashed with surprise, but he seemed to understand everything immediately. Silence hung between us, and in that moment, I felt the tension between us become almost palpable. Jessica, he finally said, his voice low and calm, I didn't expect to see you here. Neither did I replied. trying to keep myself steady. Inside, I was filled with conflicting emotions, mixed and contradictory. I thought we both decided to take a break. A break! He nodded, his gaze becoming more intense. Perhaps you're right, but it seems to me that we're both not being entirely honest with ourselves, are we? His words, his confidence, his gaze. All of it seemed to strip me bare, laying all my doubts out in the open. I knew I should have expected this, but every time I tried to walk away, he pulled me back like a magnet. Graham, I began, struggling to express the thoughts tearing me apart. I think this has gone too far. You've become something more to me than I could allow. What does allow mean? He asked with a hint of irony. Feelings aren't something we choose. They're something that chooses us. I looked at him, feeling each of his words, each movement stirring me. His confidence, his calm readiness to accept reality, made me feel like he understood me better than I understood myself. But at the same time, I realized that this confidence was what made our relationship impossible. I couldn't let myself go further down this path. But we can't control everything, I said quietly, trying to regain my composure. I'm confused, and it's pulling me under. Graham listened silently, without interrupting. I saw that his face had become serious, but he didn't avert his eyes or turn away. His presence was too close, too personal for me to continue as before. You've always been free, Jessica, he said, his voice soft yet firm. Perhaps I was mistaken in thinking you'd want to take a risk. Maybe this really isn't your path. His words sobered me. His straightforwardness, his willingness to accept reality as it was, hit harder than I expected. I realized that I wasn't ready to be the kind of person who would cross all lines for a feeling. My marriage, my life, my career, they all meant more to me than I had thought. And this conversation was the moment when I finally understood that I wanted to stay in my own reality, no matter how difficult it might be. Graham, I'm grateful for everything that's been between us, I said, struggling to find the right words. But I can't. I can't be a part of this anymore. A shadow of disappointment flickered in his eyes, but he nodded, as if he had been expecting this moment. We stood facing each other, and I knew he accepted my words, even if they caused him pain. All right, Jessica, he answered quietly. If this is your choice, I respect it. His voice was calm, but I sensed the bitterness beneath it. We were saying goodbye, not just as acquaintances. Between us was an entire story, and its ending felt painful, yet inevitable. I looked at him, knowing that I would no longer see that look, that smile, those moments that had become something important to me. I turned, trying to keep my composure, feeling tears begin to well up in my eyes. This evening marked the end of the little life we had created together, but I knew it was something I needed. When Alex suggested taking a short vacation to spend some time together, I felt a mix of surprise and doubt. We both knew there was a wall between us, and it seemed we had long since accepted it, merely viewing our detachment as something inevitable. But his suggestion hinted that he might still want to change things. That thought was both encouraging and frightening, because over the past few months, I had built up so much inside me that hiding it any longer was impossible. We chose a quiet place on the coast, a small hotel on a rocky shore, where we could walk along a secluded beach and escape from the world. The drive to the hotel passed in silence, but not the usual routine silence. It was as if we were both waiting for something, subconsciously understanding that this trip would be decisive. When we arrived, the evening air was cool and salty, and the echoes of the waves could be heard even through the closed windows. The first day passed calmly, almost evenly. We walked along the shore, talking about things unrelated to us: work, the weather, plans for the house, almost as if building protective walls around us. But on the second day, sitting at breakfast in the hotel's small restaurant, I realized I couldn't keep going like this. I saw Alex saying something, trying to entertain me, but my thoughts were far from this lightness. I needed to confess what was weighing on me, and I knew the time had come. When we returned to the room, I was silent for a long time, gathering my thoughts, while he waited patiently. Finally, I sat down across from him, feeling the heavy, daunting weight of starting this conversation, knowing that it might be the end. Alex, we need to talk, I began, trying to keep calm. He looked at me closely, a flicker of concern in his eyes. Perhaps he had always known this conversation was inevitable, but kept putting it off. He nodded, as if to say, I'm ready. I understand that I've changed lately, I said, gathering my thoughts. In our marriage, I feel like we've lost something very important. I tried to ignore it for a long time, but now, I just can't pretend that everything's fine anymore. Alex sighed heavily, and I saw him struggling to find the right words. You're right, Jessica, he answered quietly. I feel it too. It seems like we both just gave up. The words hung in the air, and the silence between us felt impenetrable. I felt the weight of the truth pressing on me, but I wasn't going to stop. Alex, I don't just feel an emptiness. I tried to fill it. Maybe not in the right way, but there was someone with whom I was close. And it meant something to me. Those words slipped from my lips, and I was afraid to look him in the eyes, fearing what I might see. But gathering my courage, I lifted my gaze. Alex sat silently, his face showing no anger, but in his eyes was pain, deep, piercing, and it hurt me more than anything else. Is it Graham? He asked, squinting slightly. I nodded, unable to find words. Alex closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose, as if trying to focus. A deafening silence followed, and I thought he was about to leave the room, slamming the door. But instead, he spoke with a heavy sigh. Why didn't you tell me earlier? There was no condemnation in his voice, only sincere disappointment, and perhaps an attempt to understand. I felt a stream of words pouring out of me. Finally, I could speak freely, openly, because I didn't even know what it meant to me. We've been so far from each other. I just wanted to feel something that reminded me of who I am. But now I realize that it won't work. I tried to find myself with someone else, but all this time, I should have been talking to you. He sat silently, staring into the void. At last, he slowly turned to me. You know, I wasn't honest with myself either, he said with a bitter smile. I saw that something was wrong, but thought that if I just ignored it, it would go away. But it didn't go away, it just piled up. I don't want us to keep going as we were, I said quietly, studying his face. If there's a chance, a real chance, we need to be honest with each other. And what are you proposing? He asked, looking at me with a seriousness and curiosity I hadn't seen before. Let's try to understand what's left between us, if there's anything at all. I can't promise that everything will go back to how it was, but I'm willing to try if you are too. He looked at me for a long time, and in that moment, I felt that there was still something between us worth fighting for. He sighed and nodded. All right, he said. Let's try to be honest. It wasn't a promise, nor a guarantee that our marriage would be restored. But in those words, there was a spark of hope that hadn't been there for a long time. We both understood that a difficult path lay ahead, that we could no longer hide behind habits and routines. And perhaps, in this moment, by revealing the truth, we had truly begun something new. Several weeks had passed since that evening at the hotel, when I confessed everything to Alex. Our conversation had been painful and honest, and afterward, I wasn't sure if we could recover what felt lost. But that honesty was what gave us the chance to start anew. We decided to work on our relationship, knowing that trust, once broken, isn't easy to restore. Each day, I realized I didn't actually need a new romance. I craved something much deeper, a genuine connection, understanding, and attention that had been missing in our marriage for so long. In the beginning, it was hard. Alex and I had both grown accustomed to avoiding sharp edges, preferring to talk about neutral topics. But now, excuses and hints didn't work. I understood that I needed to push myself and stop fearing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. We started with simple conversations over dinner, trying to listen to each other and ask questions we had once avoided. "How are you really feeling?" Alex asked one evening, setting his fork down on the edge of his plate and meeting my gaze for the first time, as though he expected a real answer instead of the usual, "Everything's fine." His question caught me off guard, but at the same time, I realized he was ready to hear my truth. "I feel like, for the first time in a long time, we're truly together," I replied, not looking away. "Before, I felt alone, even when we were close. But now, when you ask and genuinely listen, it gives me hope." Alex paused in thought and finally nodded. His eyes showed something I hadn't seen in a while: sincere interest and a willingness to change for both of us. We agreed to go for walks or take small trips every week, not as an obligation, but as an opportunity to escape daily routines and rediscover each other. Initially, it felt awkward, as if we were play acting a return to the beginning of our relationship, but I realized that in these moments, there was space for real closeness. One day, we found ourselves on our favorite hill overlooking the city, and, under the quiet evening sky, conversations flowed more easily than they did at the dinner table. "Why did you choose me back then?" he asked as we sat on a blanket, looking at the city lights in the distance. His question was unexpected but important. I thought for a moment, going back to the time when our relationship was just beginning. "I felt that with you, I'd found peace and security," I replied. "You were always someone I could rely on. But over time, that peace turned into routine, and I felt lost. Then, Graham appeared, and I saw in him something I was missing in you." Alex listened silently, and I sensed the tension in the air. But instead of reacting with bitterness or hurtful words, he nodded. "I understand," he finally said. "Maybe I really did forget that relationships need not only stability, but also attention." The words sounded simple, but behind them lay a willingness to change. And with each conversation like this, I understood more clearly that I didn't need a romance with someone else to feel alive. I needed Alex to see me, to understand how much his support and interest meant to me. Deep down, I wasn't looking for something new. I wanted to regain what I had lost. We started dedicating more time to our interests, and it brought us closer. One day, I suggested going to an art exhibit, and to my surprise, Alex agreed. That evening, he seemed ready to explore something he hadn't shown interest in before. "I never thought I could understand this chaos," he said, studying one of the installations. "But now I see something more in it. Maybe it reflects what we feel inside, something we can't always express." I looked at him and smiled. This was the same Alex I had fallen in love with, a man who could find meaning where others saw only form. His willingness to learn, to change, to become closer to what was important to me, warmed me more than I could have anticipated. Our conversations grew deeper, more open, and I realized that, for the first time in a long while, I genuinely wanted to be with him, to work on our relationship. We both made the choice to move forward, to face challenges and be honest. And although I still had to occasionally grapple with the pain of the past, I began to believe that together we could overcome it. Every day, I grew more aware that all this pain, disappointment, and doubt had been nothing more than a consequence of a lack of attention. I had looked for love and understanding from someone else because at some point, Alex and I had stopped seeing each other. But now I saw that he was ready to change that, and I was ready for it, too. When I decided to leave the gallery, it felt both terrifying and liberating. I sensed that I was finally returning to myself, that I no longer wanted to be just a part of someone else's project. The years I spent creating exhibitions, organizing events, and working with an endless stream of guests had left me feeling drained. Working at the gallery had been an important part of my life, but now I realized I needed to move on and build something of my own. I decided to open a small art studio in an old house on a quiet street. The space was small but cozy, and it was perfect for bringing my ideas to life, holding intimate exhibitions, and offering workshops. The studio became a symbol of a new chapter where I could create freely without constant pressure. Here, I could finally speak a language that only I understood, rediscovering myself through art. When Alex learned about my decision, he supported me, but his expression conveyed something beyond simple approval. There was a question in his eyes, one that had lingered between us for the past few months. We both sensed that we were at a new stage, but it didn't guarantee that we could return to what once was. We understood that our relationship would be different, though we only vaguely knew in what way. One evening, he stopped by the studio after work. I invited him into the gallery, where my new pieces were displayed, and we talked about what lay ahead for both of us. "Are you truly happy here?" he asked, looking closely at one of my photos, which showed mist over a forest. "This place, it feels more like you than the gallery ever did." I smiled, feeling warmth from his words. "Yes, I like it here," I replied. "I feel like I can finally be myself. I don't have to play a role or meet anyone else's expectations." Alex nodded, but his gaze lingered on me longer than usual. I realized he wanted to say something more. "And what about us?" he finally asked, lowering his eyes and folding his arms across his chest. "Are you ready to be with me, now that we both have this new beginning?" The question hung in the air, like a thread stretched between us. We both knew we had changed during this time, that we were no longer the people we were at the start of our relationship. And although I still felt a deep attachment to him, a question echoed within me, one I didn't know the answer to myself. Was it possible to build something new on the ruins of what had fallen apart? I walked to the window, looking at the street where evening lights were starting to appear one by one. Inside, I felt two emotions pulling at each other: the desire to be with him and the fear that we might lose what we had started to rebuild. I believed we could overcome it, but I also knew our path wouldn't be easy. "Alex," I said, turning to him, "I think I'm ready to try, but I still need time. I don't want to make another mistake. Let's move slowly, step by step, to figure out where we stand." He nodded, and a mix of disappointment and hope showed in his eyes. He came closer, and we stood silently side by side, watching the light from the street lamps outside. I felt his hand on mine and squeezed it in return. "All right," he said. "We'll start from the very beginning, step by step. We've both changed, and maybe that's not such a bad thing." Those words sounded like a promise, but not a certainty. I knew the future was uncertain, with both danger and beauty in it. We couldn't know where this new path would lead us, but for both of us, this moment became a fresh starting point. We didn't know if we could fully restore the closeness we once had or find something new, but for the first time in a long time, I felt I could embrace it not as a loss, but as a chance. The story remained open-ended, but this openness no longer felt frightening. We had given each other freedom and a chance, and it was more than just an attempt to save our marriage. It was a genuine desire to understand who we were and to try to build something meaningful again.